Good evening. Tonight, we start with something darker than the stories I usually tell at bedtime. The full chronicle of methamphetamine, the infamous wonder drug once believed, to grant boundless energy, which turned into one of the most damaging chemicals of our time. Forget the glamorous television stories and the notion of a magical booster. This tale involves battlefield tests, ambitious science, ruthless commerce, and human existence slowly falling apart. The reality is, if you found yourself in any phase of its climb, on a war front where it was distributed as fuel, in a research facility where chemistry merged with profit, or in a neighborhood left dealing with its wreckage, you would quickly understand how thin the boundary is between hope and disaster. If this interests you, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and share in the comments where you are watching from and what hour it is in your location. I find it fascinating to learn about the diverse places viewers call home. Now, turn down the lights and join me on tonight's exploration together. The narrative opens quietly and distant from the research centers and military camps that would later feature prominently among the small, hardy bushes that grow in the arid earth of Central Asia and northern China. Ephedra, known as ma huang in the texts that scholars and healers preserved on their shelves, carried the scent of the dry warmth of the steppes when it was brewed down. Sharp and sharply uncomplicated, the vapors brought a nasal clearness that communities, valued especially during cold seasons and in dusty traveling caravans for thousands of years. That vapor served as medicine in the way a cozy wrap serves as medicine, humble, regional, and trustworthy in effect. The healers of the Han dynasty documented ma huang as a treatment for coughs and blockages. Later, botanical records recommended infusions for breathing troubles, for chills, for the clouded mind of illness. What those records could not foresee was that hidden in a leaf and a stem lay a compound that could be extracted and transformed into a tool of unending alertness. In the closing years of the 1800s, a Japanese scientist named Nagai Nagayoshi handled that tool as one handles a challenging, intriguing puzzle in the fading light of a quiet afternoon. Nagai studied in Japan's advancing laboratories and opened ma huang to the scrutinizing gaze that modern chemical knowledge was directing toward natural substances. In the middle of the 1880s, he separated the alkaloid ephedrine from the plant. In doing this, he accomplished the minor wonder that drug science had been offering since magic became systematic: the transformation of a folk remedy into one single, repeatable chemical substance. By identifying and isolating ephedrine, he achieved something that over time mattered far beyond the separation itself. He registered a botanical fact on the record of synthetic opportunity. Once a substance is identified, chemists around the world can observe it, examine it, modify it. They can picture cousins and competitors. They can, and they did, create fresh compounds. The journey from ephedrine to methamphetamine is, in one respect, a brief chemical step. In another respect, it is an extensive account of laboratories and movement, of documents shared through mail, of the noise of licensing bureaus and the subtle hum of factory machinery. Nagai's efforts, his precise extraction of plant chemicals, entered the body of knowledge in organic chemistry, and that body of knowledge traveled through the networks of the era, the publications and gatherings that connected Tokyo to Berlin and London, professors to their pupils, corporations to their internal scientists. The late 1800s and early 1900s were a time when the chemistry of alkaloids became a respectable, quantifiable enterprise. The commercial hunger for separable, patentable molecules was becoming strong. Firms were seeking new stimulants, new airway openers, new tonics to market to doctors dealing with contemporary ailments, sleep problems, city exhaustion, nasal stuffiness in the urban centers that were becoming more hectic and drier each year. It was within this setting that a second Japanese chemist, Akira Ogata, improved what had been an interesting laboratory outline into a form suitable for a medicine container. Around 1919, Ogata discovered a workable method to manufacture a crystalline hydrochloride version of the substance that, when correctly measured, created stimulating results. That crystallization is more than a laboratory technique. It is the instant a molecule becomes tradable, simple to measure, simple to transport, and thus simple to market. A freebase that is slippery and unreliable is a subject of scholarly curiosity. A crystalline salt that rests in a container like a small white guarantee is something for the business sections. Suddenly, the route from ma huang to mattress and marketplace was direct. A plant, a separated alkaloid, a laboratory conversion, and a stable salt that could be relied upon in the drugstore. Science did not advance in isolation. The major Meiji periods in Japan had connected the island's chemists into a worldwide conversation with their European counterparts, and a globalizing drug industry in Europe and the United States was eager for compounds that offered both innovation and innovation's partner, exclusive ownership. Licensing practices in the early 1900s had developed from 19th century industrialization. Companies wanted not only to discover, but to possess, to label, to promote. The chemistry that Nagai and Ogata practiced, therefore, touched the legal and business structures of their time. A crystalline salt could be licensed in several regions. A license granted not just exclusivity, but the vocabulary of credibility for marketing teams wanting to establish a position in physicians' cabinets. Markets were prepared. The opening decades of the 1900s turned people into buyers of not only food and garments, but also of rest and focus. Hospitals and medical offices were adjusting to fresh diagnostic labels. Doctors were charged with managing modern existence under the stress of industrial schedules and wartime demands. Drug companies, some modest, some already worldwide, recognized possibility. They had mastered how to take a fixed recipe, wrap it in a commercial name, and present it to the doctor as a dependable tool. The chemistry handled the rest. A mixture of laboratory resources and business enthusiasm turned a traditional remedy into a substance that could be manufactured at volume, marked with a trademark, and introduced into the channels of medicine and everyday existence. By the 30s, that introduction picked up momentum. The pill's shift from a laboratory oddity to medicine happened under the watchful gaze of advertising and the gentler power of expert approval. In medical offices and in publications, the fresh stimulant was shown as a solution for particular modern complaints. Narcolepsy, the abrupt and dangerous collapse into slumber, depression, the weariness that modern existence sometimes caused, obesity, the social and medical issue that many doctors and patients were tackling with hunger suppressants, and the constant annoyance of nasal blockage, which factories and cities had not succeeded in curing through rules or airflow. Drug firms, always ready with a commercial name and a catchphrase, released products with the confidence of those who had learned the principles of the market. Names were selected for their gentle guarantee: methedrin in the English-speaking world, Philipon in Japan, Pervitin in Germany. They were shown as exact doses of chemical clarity, small gems of function that doctors could include in a patient's plan. The business methods of the time influenced how these molecules were viewed. Firms trained sales workers to visit doctors' offices, to leave samples and specimens in pockets and drawers, to speak the proper language about dosing and purposes. The representative from a drug company would provide a booklet of medical studies, anecdotal as they frequently were, and a few personal recommendations from doctors in respected hospitals. Advertising took another path, reaching directly into the patient-practitioner connection through medical publications and, in some nations, consumer pages. There were shiny advertisements and small, serious notices. There were case studies that claimed remarkable outcomes in a handful of patients and suggested that the remainder of medicine simply had not been paying attention. The medical culture of the 30s and 40s was mildly trusting in a manner that later decades would not be. Doctors were taught to act, to step in. They had, in many medical offices, fewer choices for ongoing tiredness and mood than we picture today. The diagnostic labels themselves were more flexible. Neurasthenia was still taught at many medical schools. Melancholia had beds in institutions and outpatient offices. Many sufferers of what we might now term clinical depression received stimulant orders because stimulants functioned rapidly, and rapid results were a currency doctors appreciated. The instant relief of mental haze or the quick reduction of hunger in a patient determined to lose weight were visible, quantifiable results. The extended consequences were less easily counted in the brief clinical trial. Truly enormous pressures pushed prescriptions into standard practice. The Great Depression had strangely increased hunger for the small medical wonders that suggested energy without rest. Factories requested workers who could remain awake. Offices desired alert clerks, and housewives desired an advantage to handle the constant chores of modern home life. Doctors who focused on mental health and in general practice learned to write orders for their patients and for themselves. Tonics became a proper therapeutic category. There was also an ease in the regulatory structures of many countries. Before the strict controls of the post-war period, Many stimulants were accessible with a physician's signature or even over the counter in some versions. The lack of modern drug monitoring meant that medical practice could change by custom more than by proof. Marketing functioned side by side with prescribing. Advertisements for weight reduction leaned strongly on the visual and social worries of the time. Magazines featured before and after pictures and stories that read like the testimonials of later diet cultures. Medical publications printed control trials, small and often brief, that confirmed hunger reduction and mood improvement. Sales workers left samples in the hands of doctors, and sometimes in the waiting areas where worried patients might discover them and request the new promise by name. A pill that allowed a woman to reduce size could be described as healing. A tablet that kept a night shift binding clerk awake could be ordered as sensible. Dependence was a word that had not yet gathered its present medical exactness. Habit and excessive use were words used only briefly in the minor studies and case reports that appeared in specialty publications. Elsewhere in the world, drug development took different shapes that mirrored local industry and local wishes. In Japan, Philopon appeared on the market, distributed by industrial-scale makers, and it seeped into both medicine cabinets and the wider labor force. In the United States, the family of amphetamines, relatives to methamphetamine, appeared under commercial names and in inhalers. Firms like Smith, Klein, and French had already learned how to take a stimulant and make it a standard product for nasal clearing and for the management of focus and wakefulness in particular situations. Doctors wrote for tablets as they had once written for bromides and for barbiturates, with a feeling that one was using an available tool in the medical range of choices. The advertisements promised safety. The language was one of control, not surrender. The oversight was not merely belief. Research that followed long-term results lagged behind marketing cycles. The costs of chronic stimulant use, dependence, tolerance, mood instability, hunger disruption, developed on a schedule longer than the advertising budgets. Early signals came in the shape of case reports and letters among doctors, accounts of racing hearts, of sleeplessness that lasted beyond the intended prescription, of irritability and increased hostility crossed desks in hospitals and in drug firms. But these reports arrived like small waves against a large current of accepted therapeutic use. It requires time for a culture, a profession, a governing body, a market to turn from broad acceptance to careful doubt. The turn sped up when the laboratories and the showrooms where stimulants had been sold met with militaries that needed bodies to move, to remain awake, to perform beyond the regular hours and overnight. The Second World War presented a stage on which the guarantees of stimulant chemistry could be examined at volume. If a pill could keep a pilot awake through a night mission, then the tactical and operational benefits were instant and clear to those planning campaigns. If a tablet could keep a soldier marching without rest, the pace of an army could theoretically be maintained at levels that the opposition might not be ready for. The drug science of wakefulness became a piece of strategy. Germany, early and energetically, seized that piece. The Berlin drug firm Temmler Werke, a modest company that had entered the market with a stimulant product, manufactured and trademarked Pervitin in the late 30s. Pervitin, a methamphetamine preparation, was sold first in the German civilian market as a stimulant for tiredness, a remedy for concentration, a small chemical sun to brighten grey days. Then the Wehrmacht took notice. In 39 and into 40, during the campaigns that opened the war in Europe, invasions of Poland and then the lightning campaigns through the Low countries and France in the spring of 1940, Pervitin found its way into the supply lists of the German army. Soldiers were given tablets to keep them alert during long drives in the cold, to make night marches possible, to maintain the pace central to the blitzkrieg doctrine that stressed movement and surprise. The reasoning was as harsh as it was tempting. Speed wins battles. Speed requires focus and the willing endurance of soldiers. Stimulants supply endurance. Military planners in Germany and elsewhere believed they had discovered a modern, mechanical advantage that would not display itself on a map or a balance sheet in the same manner as tanks or bullets, but would be real in the timing of an advance and the distances troops could cover without rest. Pervitin made whole nights into days. It made hunger less urgent. It reduced the number of rest stops. Logistics officers drew up supply lists that included boxes of pills in the same breath they listed rations and ammunition. Scale here matters. What had been a drugstore item in city windows suddenly became a supply commodity. Temmler's production expanded. and the Wehrmacht's requisitioning system adapted. Small metal tins and paper envelopes of tablets were packed into field kits and medics' chests. Supply officers counted tablets like bullets. The distribution patterns show the seriousness with which the military embraced chemical aids. The tablets were present not only in special units, but across a range of forces: panzer crews, infantry on forced marches, radio operators, and bomber pilots. The outcome in the very short term was a rise in operational pace and a capacity to carry out 24-hour operations with reduced focus on rest cycles. This was not a one-sided occurrence of the Axis. Allied forces facing their own supply and tactical problems made similar practical choices, though often with different drug preferences. British pilots and air crews, including in the RAF during the Battle of Britain and in following air campaigns, used amphetamines, benzodrine inhalers and later tablets to fight off sleep on long missions. The United States military, dealing with the same need to keep air crews and ground troops alert, approved the use of stimulants in carefully outlined situations. In Japan, Philippon went from the civilian market into the factories and the military, where authorities saw in a stimulant both a productivity tool and a way to endure wartime hardships. In short, stimulants became part of the set of tools a modern army could use to bend human limits. Drugs, rations, training, and technology all mixed in the calculation of victory. The human costs, when they became visible, did not shine so much as build up like tiny debts on a ledger. Field reports from medicine officers in the Wehrmacht noted incidents of hallucination, of aggression, of breakdowns that local doctors suspected were linked to heavy and extended use of Pervitin. There were operational effects. Soldiers with damaged judgment whose risk evaluation was distorted by stimulant-driven confidence, units that suffered from a rashness that threatened discipline. Some commanders became worried not about the instant loss of sleep, but about the breakdown of command and control, when troops, fueled by stimulants, took risks without the sober pause that rest would supply. The very quality that commanders had welcomed, reduced tiredness, could in excess create errors. The medical community around the armies began to notice patterns: addiction and withdrawal, psychosis triggered by extended high doses, and the simple math of tolerance. A soldier who needed one tablet to march for a day might need two for the next. The supply chain would be forced to meet that increase, and logistics would be drawn into a feedback circle that made armies reliant on drug supply as much as on fuel. Where supply weakened, the effects could be as tactical as any shortage of food or ammunition. The super soldier thus showed an Achilles heel. The enhancement was itself reliant on continuous supply, and it shifted strategic calculations toward the weakness of the pill train. There were reports and eventual policy reactions. German military medical authorities, faced with rising case reports of dependence and with anecdotal proof that stimulant use could harm unit unity, tried to regulate and to limit distribution as the war dragged on and casualties and supply stresses grew. The initial excitement cooled in some areas into caution. In Britain and in the United States, where amphetamines had been distributed to meet similar needs, medical officers were aware of come-downs and of mood swings that followed stimulant use, and they advised moderation even where operational need required some use. The wartime calculation was not merely morale, it was practical. The question became not whether stimulants could raise a soldier's endurance for a single night's mission. They did, but whether reliance on them could be maintained without hurting fighting capacity over campaigns measured in months and years. Beyond the battlefield, the presence of stimulants in wartime life changed societies. In occupied and allied countries alike, pills moved in home fronts as much as in foxholes. Industrial managers in wartime economies experimented with Philippon and similar products as a way to keep production lines moving through air raids and blackouts. Civilian populations facing rationing and round-the-clock work sometimes reach for stimulants as a last dependable energy source. The line between healing use and performance enhancement blurred. The term doping was not yet a household criticism in the way it became later. There is a quiet irony in the account, one that tastes faintly of the dark humor historians sometimes permit themselves when noting that the pride of modernity often dresses itself in small tablets, the same chemistry, that separated ephedrine from a shrub on a slope in Inner Asia had moved in a few decades into the pockets of soldiers and the briefcases of executives, into advertising copy and into the margins of medical journals. The laboratory's crystalline product promised focus, quickness, and a discipline of pace that strategists desired. The pill was, in the moment, a tactical tool as much as a healing one. But tools have costs. They require supply, oversight, and care. The adoption of methamphetamine and its relatives across the interwar and wartime decades shows the modern state's negotiation with human limits. We can extend wakefulness and endurance. We can change hunger and mood, but we do so at the cost of creating dependencies and supply weaknesses that a campaign planner and a public health official must weigh. The drug promise of the super soldier disappeared in the face of operational data that showed its limits. The moral and medical costs that were hidden in sales meetings and in early clinical trials came into sight on the wards and in the reports of regimental surgeons. So the account folded back on itself. The molecule that began its public life in a herbal steam inhalation moved into laboratories and out into markets, and then into the centers of power where strategy is made. It performed admirably in short, dazzling bursts of performance, and then it left behind patterns of dependence and fields of second-order problems. Supply lines that could be cut, units that required ever more tablets to function, and individuals who suffered downstream effects that medicine and society were slow to record. In the small-scale view of a pill's journey from shrub to clinic to battlefield, we see the interplay of curiosity, commerce, and control that marks much of 20th century medical history. What begins as an answer to a problem of focus becomes, in total, an ethical and supply question about what societies will give up in the name of endurance. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world that had taken stimulants to stay awake was finally still, the rooms where those decisions had been made, the hospital offices, the military planning rooms, the corporate boardrooms, filled with a different sound. The sound of consequences building up like unread messages. The chemical that promised to make men into machines instead made them into dependents of a supply system. And once the supply broke, the fiction of the super soldier showed itself in full. A soldier could be faster, sharper, and then suddenly less dependable if the pill that had been his engine was not there when needed. The strategic calculation had always been more complicated than the marketing had allowed. There is a soft, bitter humor in the arithmetic. A drug that promised to outpace tiredness required an entire logistics wing to stay effective. A campaign that could be sped up with a few pills required additional convoys to bring the pills. The laboratory's quiet triumph had set in motion a fresh set of needs that militaries and societies were obliged to meet. The grand illusion of instant human enhancement colliding with the grinding reality of supply and of human biology is an old theme. Speed only reveals the next bottleneck. In this case, the bottleneck was human. The super soldier became, in time, an army of people who required more than adrenaline. They required rest, care, and a supply chain that an exhausted nation could not always guarantee. The account of methamphetamine's early life, from the powdery smells of ancient apothecaries to the clean-lined bottles of interwar medicine and onward into the field kits of modern armies, is thus a parable of modernization. It shows how small laboratory histories can become national strategies, and how medical cultures, advertising practices, and military logistics can align to make a promising compound into a global occurrence. The chemistry was elegant, the commerce was nimble, the strategy was tempting. The costs unfolded slowly at first, and then more clearly in reports, and in the quiet of hospital wards, and in the post-war accounts that would change how societies regulated such substances. And so, in the hush after the campaigns and the signing of treaties, the world began to see what had been done. The very same molecules that had carried people through nights of urgency also left traces of consequence in the lives of those who had used them. It is a lesson the modern age learned in fits and starts, that the power to change focus and hunger is not merely a technical triumph, but a social force that changes how work is organized, how war is conducted, and how medicine is practiced. The shrub on the step had been simple. The consequences, like any true nighttime tale, were complicated and long. The crates did not so much arrive as unravel themselves into civilian life, as if the seams of war had simply loosened and released whatever the bellies of armies had once held. In the late 40s and the 50s, the boxes that had been stamped and stacked for blitzkrieg runouts and imperial last resort pushes found new freight forwarders, pharmacies, factory dispensaries, company doctors' cabinets. The stimulant that had been enlisted to sharpen soldiers' vision and steady hands Once named for 1,000 practical purposes under names like Pervitin or Philipon in Europe and East Asia, Benzedrine and Dexedrine on American shelves returned home in blunt, banal forms. In Britain, a tired shift worker could still be offered an amphetamine to keep the lamps burning. In the United States, mothers of the post-war boom were whispered weight loss cures that smelled faintly of industry and aerodromes. In Japan, the residue of wartime distribution fed a black market that soon became a public health problem by the end of the decade. What the drug had been for empires, it would now become for economies. A commodity repurposed, repackaged, normalized. Normalization feels like a small mercy when the rest of the world is rebuilding. The pills were bright, the ads reassuring, and the science smelled like laboratories and progress. Physicians, stretched thin by the demands of demobilization and the flood of new patients with new ailments, reached for stimulants as dependable tools to treat narcolepsy, to counter melancholia, to lift the languor of the chronically tired. Easy diagnosis, easy cures, efficient pills. Across the mid-century Anglophone press, the image of the PEP tablet grew domestic wings. Dexedrine, Benzedrine, the names were almost friendly. They promised punctuality, alertness, an extra hour for housewives, truckers, students, and typists who were paid in productivity rather than in sleep. Pharmacists dispensed these tablets with a sort of anxious enthusiasm, and patients took them with the innocent confidence of those who trust. Labels and clinical trials. The street smell of after-work cafes and late-night garages carried the faint tang of stimulant commerce long after the war flags came down. But as the glow of convenience spread, small shadows grew on the margins of case studies and clinical reports. By the 50s and into the 60s, psychiatrists and neurologists in hospitals from London to Los Angeles were recording patterns that did not fit the brochure. Dependency, tolerance, the peculiar delirium known as amphetamine psychosis. The term itself is clinical and unromantic, but behind it were nights of paranoia and violence, weeks of sleepless descent and cognitive erosion, patients who had taken promises and found new prisons. Epidemiologists began to collect this clinical unease into population-level data. Where availability was high, so were admissions for stimulant-related disorders. Where prescription controls were lax, so too was the shadow economy that sold secret pills in vending spots and under-the-table pharmacies. In Tokyo and Osaka, the black market circulation of Philipon reached epidemic proportions in the late 40s and 50s, a social problem so visible that it demanded a legislative response. In the United States, the image of the benevolent medical small dose was eroded slowly by headlines and coroners' reports. In the United Kingdom, the National Health Service and professional bodies began to issue cautious guidance. Regulation is seldom a single clean cut. It is build-up, a council here, a ban there, a binding agreement adopted at the United Nations. The global structure that would come to limit stimulants unfolded in stages and with the leisurely bureaucracy of diplomacy and post-war prudence. The Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961 had consolidated controls on opiates and coca, but it was the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances that would formally bring amphetamines and methamphetamine under a modern international scheduling system. That treaty, negotiated as the second wave of the UN's attempt to globalize drug policy, reflected an uneasy agreement. Substances that had proper medical uses would be regulated, but their non-medical circulation would be criminalized. Nations, often reluctantly, signed on. Before that international milestone, national levers had already begun to move. In the United States, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 reshaped the federal regulatory landscape, classifying drugs into schedules and remaking the legal ground on which prescription and manufacture stood. The Drug Enforcement Administration followed in '73 to police the new order. Japan enacted strict stimulant control measures in the early 50s as it confronted the Philipon crisis. And in many European nations, the post-war years brought progressively tighter prescriptions, packet accounting, and licensing systems for manufacturers and distributors. What these measures achieved in part was a narrowing of legitimate channels. Production and distribution for approved medical and industrial uses continued, but the paperwork and oversight increased. Manufacturers had to account for batches. Pharmacies kept more detailed logs. Prescribing doctors faced professional attention and occasionally legal danger. That narrowing was intended at once to protect patients and to dry up illicit supply. History teaches us, however, that demand is a stubborn river. Where you dam it, it finds new channels. Medical caution, epidemiological evidence, and the moral authority of international treaty systems did what they could. They distilled a truth that had been murmuring in clinics and emergency rooms. This family of drugs could do genuine healing good and genuine social harm. Governments, halfway between paternalism and liberalism, chose control. The consequence, predictable to any student of markets, was that an underground economy would grow to take advantage of the opportunities that regulation creates. The economy that grew was both small and enormous. In the beginning, there were domestic kitchens, garages, and motel rooms where secret manufacture took place on a scale adapted to local demand. Small, nimble, imperfect. The products were sold in angry little markets, highways and dime stores, sex work corridors, and farm co-ops. These labs were hazardous, of course, leaky with chemicals and secrecy. And for every small operation there were busts that made local news. But smallness has an advantage when the aim is to avoid detection. It also had an economic reasoning that suited the pockets of rural America, outlying towns in Australia, and neighborhoods in post-industrial Europe. The cash yields were significant relative to other local economic options. Unemployment and marginalization provided a steady stream of cheap labor and low-opportunity entrepreneurship. A meth lab in a trailer on the edge of a town could produce a month's wages for a family under conditions that, if discovered, would lead to eviction, environmental cleanup costs, and sometimes prison. The moral calculation was raw and practical. For some, the meth economy was not a chosen vice, but a chosen survival technique. By the late 80s and into the 90s, economic incentives began to reshape production geographies. The United States, where rural meth labs became notorious in states like Missouri, Arkansas, and parts of the Midwest, saw a dramatic rise in production and a shifting composition of the market. Powdered amphetamine forms were joined by crystalline methamphetamine, a product with a higher perceived purity and a longer shelf life that was especially suitable for smoking. The consumption ritual that reinforced regular use and potent craving. Meanwhile, producers in Mexico, initially exporters of marijuana and heroin, found meth to be a profitable addition. Cartels that already had cross-border smuggling infrastructures and access to capital began to invest in larger production facilities. What journalists and officials would come to call super labs. These super labs were not the domestic improvisations of earlier decades. They were industrial operations with the capacity to process precursor inflows into multi-ton outputs for regional and international distribution. The logistics were straightforward in their basics. Bulk chemicals required bulk movement. Bulk movement favored ports, trucking routes, corrupt intermediaries who could smooth shipments through customs, and territories where local authority could be bribed or pressured. The cartels deployed those mechanisms with the same corporate reasoning they had used for other commodities. Enforcement hardened in response. The United States introduced regulatory controls aimed not only at illicit manufacture, but at the ingredients that made that manufacture possible. The Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 is a neat pivot point in this account. Congress moved to restrict over-the-counter access to pseudoephedrine and ephedrine, common precursors, by restricting sales, mandating behind-the-counter placement, limiting quantities per purchaser, and requiring identification and transaction logs. Within months and years, the visible domestic production of meth in the United States, the small labs in rural trailers and motel rooms, diminished. But markets adapt. When local supply constraints bite, entrepreneurs, legitimate, illegitimate, and usually a blend of both, seek alternative channels. For meth, this meant a pivot toward international supply chains and industrialized production in geography, where enforcement or corruption were less prohibitive. Mexico's cartels seized that opening. Their super labs could exploit cheaper labor, local complicity, and the economies of scale that made production cost-effective even after factoring in smuggling losses. The result was an inversion. A drug that had long been infused into American life in small doses through medical and social normalization now flowed into the country in industrial quantities, entering urban night economies and rural towns alike. The violence that accompanied cartel control, territorial fights fought with rifles and improvised explosives, assassinations of public officials, kidnappings, became part of the drug's socio-economic footprint. President Felipe Calderón's escalation of federal forces against the cartels in 2006 marked a violent intensification of an already lethal economy. The battle for control of licit and illicit trade routes multiplied the stakes for everyone involved. Across the Pacific, Thailand in 2003, under Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, implemented a brutal and widely criticized war on drugs campaign that targeted methamphetamine use and distribution with extraordinary force. Thousands were killed in a matter of months, a grim reminder that states sometimes attempt to defeat drug markets with ferocity rather than with public health. Meanwhile, production hubs also flourished in places the global media had not always expected. The Golden Triangle, the lawless borderlands of Myanmar, Laos and Thailand, long notorious for opium, retooled parts of its production infrastructure towards synthetic stimulants. Ethnic armed groups, most notably the United Wa State Army in Myanmar's Shan State, were implicated in mass production of methamphetamine tablets destined for Southeast Asian markets. The tablets, known as yaba, were stamped with logos and colours and exported in enormous quantities across borders into Thailand, Cambodia, and beyond. They were cheap, engineered for portability and mass consumption, and they made whole economies, from small traders to corrupt officials, complicit in their passage. In Europe, the dissolution of Soviet-era controls and the expansion of chemical industry capacity in Eastern Europe and China underwrote new flows of precursors and new secret laboratories in places like the Czech Republic and Poland. In each case, the dynamic was recognizably capitalist. Where demand exists, supply will be found, and where controls tighten in one place, suppliers will shift operations to another. Those shifts were not purely geographic. They were also chemical and logistical. The more effectively governments regulated specific precursor chemicals like pseudoephedrine and ephedrine, the more traffickers looked for alternative synthetic routes and alternative sources. Phenyl-2-propanone, P2P, and other precursors began to be used as substitutes where ephedrine-based methods were constrained. The choice of chemical pathway shapes the scale and the profile of production. Some routes require more sophisticated equipment, but yield larger batches and higher purity. Others fit the one-pot improvisations of a motel room operator better. I will not describe processes here, but it is important to note that chemical substitution opened a strategic game of adaptation. China's sprawling chemical industry, and later, Indian firms were sometimes either sources of precursors or unwitting suppliers via brokers who did not ask too many questions. Faced with the international pressure of the 1988 UN Convention against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances, the treaty that, for the first time, targeted the chemicals themselves and not only finished drugs, nations started to register precursors, introduced pre-export notification systems, and cracked down on suspicious shipments. The result was a regulatory cat-and-mouse game that has endured into the 21st century. Rule followed by adaptation, enforcement followed by innovation. Forms of methamphetamine matured in parallel with these supply chain innovations. The drug is many things to many people, depending upon its physical form and the local vocabulary that enfolds it. In the United States in the late 20th century, speed connoted the powdered form sold for insufflation or for ingestion. Crystal or ice suggested the fully formed glass-like shards that were meant to be smoked and that carried a cultural imprint of the West Coast and the Pacific Rim. In Southeast Asia, tablets stamped with colorful logos, the ubiquitous yaba, dominated markets engineered for concealment and rapid distribution. In Japan and Korea, the post-war fill-upon culture had once favored tablets. In the Philippines, a term like shabu entered everyday speech to denote meth in various guises. Each form has its own rituals. Tablets can be casual, slipped into pockets at parties and swallowed without paraphernalia. Powder invites social sharing, snorting at desks and dance halls. Crystalline meth encourages smoking, a consumption practice that produces a tight, intense high and a social pattern of repeated sessions that has obvious implications for dependence and harm. The forms also shape harms and public health responses. Smoking crystal meth leads to quick onset and repeated dosing, and thereby to a pattern of binging that correlates with certain social harms. Increased risky behaviors, dental damage, and acute psychiatric presentations. Tablets produce less intense immediate peaks but longer overall exposure. They're often more socially diffused, reaching broader swathes of communities at lower price points. Injection carries the additional layer of blood-borne disease risk, especially hepatitis and HIV. But the prevalence of injection varies by region and over time as social norms and public health infrastructures change. Public health responses must therefore be as multifaceted as consumption itself. Harm reduction, needle exchange, drug treatment programs tailored to stimulant dependence, and social interventions that address the economic precarity feeding the production side. In places where punitive enforcement dominated, treatment and prevention often became secondary. Where harm reduction found political purchase, outcomes, while never ideal, were measurably better in terms of disease transmission and social reintegration. Politics of precursors, meanwhile, became an arena of international negotiation and domestic contestation. Retail pharmacy sales restrictions in the United States diminished local small-scale manufacture, but created a lucrative export market for high-purity meth from Mexico and elsewhere. European Union-wide measures on precursor tracking, bilateral agreements between nations, the engagement of the International Narcotics Control Board all attempted to choke off routes of supply. China, confronted with growing evidence that chemical companies were diverting shipments, moved in the 2000s and 2010s to regulate exports and to shut down facilities implicated in diversion. India undertook its own regulatory tightening after international pressure when evidence accrued that its generics and chemical firms were being used as nodal points in precursor distribution chains. The international system is not a perfect net. It is, however, a network of levers, declarations, inspections, criminal penalties, and cooperation agreements that make some paths harder, and in so doing, reshape the choices of illicit networks. Each tightening provokes a countermove, a rerouting of shipping, a relocation of chemical synthesis, a shift in the choice of precursors, and each countermove defines the next set of policy priorities. Market innovations reflected both the physical constraints and the entrepreneurial creativity of traffickers. Packaging changed to evade detection. Pills were hidden in foodstuffs, powders resealed as harmless industrial chemicals, crystals disguised as salts. Shipping windows shifted to nighttime schedules. Couriers traveled with false backstories that fit border scrutiny. The internet introduced a new vector. By the early 2010s, darknet marketplaces such as Silk Road had demonstrated that stimulants, among many other substances, could be bought and sold with less direct physical contact, paid for in cryptocurrencies and mailed in innocuous parcels. This did not render the old routes obsolete, but it added an extra layer of distribution. Consumers in one city could order directly from a producer on another continent, and the delivery system of modern logistics made such transfers both possible and surprisingly resistant to detection. The economies built around meth are not merely criminal abstractions. They touch the weathered tables and small-town diner counting rooms, the semi-detached houses where carpet is forever stained, the shipping docks where containers pass like indifferent cities, and the borderland communities where a trucker's route has always been coextensive with the art of moving things through gaps. There are also political constituencies in miniature, manufacturers who once operated with pharmaceutical licenses, pharmacists who lose their licenses when diversion is discovered, small dealers who become, for a time, small-time bosses. State responses, from rehabilitation programs to militarized interdictions, have reshaped these economies, sometimes displacing them, but rarely eradicating them. Demand persists. Economies reorganize. Everything about meth's modern trajectory is therefore a study in adaptation. Surplus becomes normalization. Normalization begets concern. Concern yields regulation. Regulation narrows legitimate supply and enlarges illicit profit margins. Illicit producers scale and globalize. Enforcement responds with new law and diplomacy. Traffickers find new chemicals, new labs, new shipping routes, and new markets. In the end, one might say the drug's character was always twofold: a productive chemical for medical uses, a highly effective agent for social compulsions to boost productivity for a time and then help to hollow it out. That ironical duality of a chemical both useful and ruinous is what makes the history not merely moral, but material. Sometime in the haze of policy and profiteering, the world's relationship to meth reached a peculiar equilibrium. Powerful organized criminals industrialized production and became, in some regions, the primary suppliers. States wielded both soft and hard power to counter, and sometimes co-opt, the infrastructures that made supply possible. The form of the drug diversified to meet specific consumption cultures. Public health systems contended with epidemics shaped by the chemistry of delivery as much as by the chemistry of the molecule itself. The story is not yet finished. Precursor laws tighten here and loosen there. Darknet marketplaces vanish and reappear. Chemical companies change ownership and names. Each change creates a new marginal advantage for one actor or another. But across decades and continents, the pattern remains stubbornly similar. Regulation on the one hand, and market innovation on the other. A patient dance of restriction and circumvention, each informing the next step. If the drug began in factories of war as a performance enhancer for soldiers and factory workers, its modern life is an unfolding document of how modern societies try, haltingly, sometimes brutally, to organize desire and supply. The super soldier dream faded into a darker, more dispersed reality. Millions of ordinary people became consumers in varied fashions. Whole towns and some states measured their fortunes and misfortunes against the flows of stimulant income. Cartels and insurgent groups reinvented themselves as chemists and logisticians. There is a certain black comedy in it. An invention that once promised to keep nations awake wound up compelling them to stay awake and watch their own institutions scramble to keep up. On quiet nights, one can trace the market pathways like veins on a map. The Golden Triangle's long-distance trade in tablets weaving through Southeast Asian railheads. Baja California and Sinaloa's industrial output streaming northward into American cities. The Czech and Polish secret labs serving regional markets and intermittently exporting to Western Europe. The chemical brokers in East Asia, shifting paperwork and consolidating shipments when faces in Washington or Geneva begin to turn their attention. It is all logistical choreography, supply, chains pursued and interrupted. Capital-seeking returns in whatever shape the law allows or the law unwittingly provides. The human cost of those chains has been immense, but the policy lesson may be quieter and more structural. You cannot simply close a door without understanding the building that door sits in. Close the kitchen, and the pressure will drive the steam through the walls. So the post-war history of methamphetamine is not merely a catalogue of harms, nor a tale of criminal ingenuity. It is an archive of how modern states and markets co-create problems by trying to solve them. It is also, and importantly, a story of how form matters, how the difference between a pill and a shard produces different social scripts and public health responses, and of how international politics of chemicals shapes street markets and life outcomes. The treaty signatures, the radar charts of seizures, the quiet ledger of pharmacy logs, the anonymous posts on an online market, all taken together, form a map of modernity's attempt to govern pleasure and productivity. In that map, one sees recurring motifs: regulation entwined with ingenuity, prohibition followed by adaptation, local economies folded into transnational systems. If the drug was once touted to make soldiers into superhuman instruments of endurance, its modern legacy is more prosaic and more tragic. An engine that helped some people eke out livelihoods, destabilized others and bound governments, companies, and criminal organizations into an uneasy, ongoing contest over chemistry and control. When methamphetamine reaches the brain, it behaves like an uninvited messenger who not only announces himself, but pushes open the doors and drags the lights into the street. The first minutes are bright and clean. Energy surges, fatigue peels away, speech quickens, heat and hunger recede. Those sensations map cleanly onto a biochemical drama that neuroscientists have been sketching in increasing detail since the late 20th century. Meth is a potent releaser of the brain's catecholamines, most notably dopamine and norepinephrine, and it does so by commandeering the very machinery neurons use to shuttle those chemicals around. In plain language, the drug floods reward circuits, then rewires them, with consequences that begin as pleasurable and soon harden into compulsion. In the mesolimbic system, the ancient circuitry that links the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex, dopamine is the currency of salience and reinforcement. Early experiments with animals and later positron emission tomography studies in humans showed that amphetamines cause a dramatic spike of dopamine in this pathway. The young neurologist Nora Volkow, working in the 1990s and 2000s, made this visible with PET scans that correlated surges of synaptic dopamine with intense subjective euphoria and with the loss of control that defines addiction. Meth does several things at once. It sneaks into presynaptic neurons through transporters that normally remove dopamine from the synapse. It forces dopamine out of storage vesicles by disrupting the vesicular monoamine transporter, and it reverses the flow across plasma membrane transporters so that neurons pump dopamine out into the synapse instead of reabsorbing it. The result is not a gentle increase, but a torrent. Norepinephrine rises alongside dopamine, giving the body speed and the mind alertness, useful in a war and ruinous in long-term living rooms. That immediate biochemical abundance explains why meth felt like a godsend to soldiers in the 30s and 40s. In Germany, Temmler's Pervitin pills kept infantry moving in the winter of 1939. In Imperial Japan, Philipon found use among pilots and factory workers. The molecule's old celebrity on battlefields is also a cautionary note. Its capacity to override sleep and fear made it useful strategically and devastating personally. But the brain remembers. Repeat the torrent and the system adapts. Receptors are downregulated. Dopamine transporter availability falls. Neurons change their firing patterns. Circuits that once regulated impulse, judgment, and reward begin to favor habit over reason. Those changes are neither instantaneous nor entirely visible, but they are persistent. Over weeks and months of heavy use, users can find the world flattened. Nothing tastes as good as the drug. Interest fades, motivation collapses, and the drug, criminally efficient, becomes the axis around which life revolves. The chronic neural adaptations are complex, but can be sketched in humane terms. Repeated bursts of dopamine blunt the sensitivity of postsynaptic receptors. The brain's volume knob for pleasure turns down. The frontal lobes, which sit on top of the reward system and normally temper urges with plans and consequences, become functionally weaker. The habit-forming dorsal striatum grabs more control. Cue-induced craving, a smell, a familiar room, a face, triggers the aged reflex of addiction. Meanwhile, the biochemistry that once replenished neurotransmitters frays. Mitochondria are stressed, oxidative metabolites accumulate, and inflammatory microglia begin to nibble at neuronal terminals. Animal research through the 80s and 90s, and human imaging from the 90s onward, painted the same worrying picture. Meth can be neurotoxic to dopaminergic and serotonergic axons, and the damage seems to correlate with the intensity and duration of exposure. Those physiological shifts show up as real-world harms. Cognitively, chronic meth users often suffer deficits in attention, working memory, and executive function. Planning collapses into urgency, learning slows, and decisions skew toward immediate rewards. Clinicians have recognized for decades a stimulant-induced psychosis that mirrors paranoid schizophrenia, persecutory delusions, visual and auditory hallucinations, tactile hallucinations of insects under the skin that produce the infamous phenomenon known as formication. The psychosis can be transient, resolving weeks after abstinence, and yet for some, it becomes a recurring or persistent disorder that requires long-term psychiatric care. Sleep deprivation, the hallmark of prolonged binges, compounds the problem, producing a kind of sleep-starved delirium that, when layered on top of stimulant neurotoxicity, can produce profound deterioration. The body outside the skull pays too. Cardiovascular strain is immediate: tachycardia, elevated blood pressure, vasoconstriction. Acute use can precipitate arrhythmias, myocardial infarction, and stroke. Chronic use can produce a dilated cardiomyopathy, a weakening of the heart muscle that, in case series reported across the United States and Australia since the early 2000s, has been linked to meth exposure. The mechanism mixes sympathetic overdrive with direct toxicity. Hypothermia during binges, often worsened by crowded, overheated environments and dehydration, accelerates muscle breakdown, rhabdomyolysis, which can then damage kidneys. Lungs, when people smoke crystal meth, can be scarred. When they inject, veins and soft tissue infections proliferate. Wound care, antibiotics, and surgeries for abscesses become recurring costs in hospitals and clinics in regions with heavy meth prevalence. There are also the slow, visible erosions that feed headlines. Meth mouth, a pattern of severe dental decay and gum disease resulting from dry mouth, clenching, poor hygiene, and nutritional neglect. Severe weight loss, skin lesions from picking, chronic infections. But even these external signs are the aftermath of a deeper interior collapse. The immune system seems to tilt under chronic use. Susceptibility to infections rises. Sexual behavior changes under meth's influence as well. In settings where meth is used to facilitate prolonged sexual encounters, a phenomenon documented in gay urban scenes in cities like San Francisco, London, and Sydney since the late 20th century, rates of HIV and other sexually transmitted infections can rise, intertwining the epidemic of a stimulant with the age-old epidemiology of viruses. Pregnancy is a particularly acute fault line. Women who use meth while pregnant face higher rates of placental problems, preterm labor, and low birth weight babies. Neonatal exposure can produce immediate complications that require intensive care. Longer-term developmental studies are messy because socioeconomic factors, polysubstance use, and prenatal nutrition all intertwine. Yet a persistent signal emerges in cohort studies from the United States, Australia, and Europe. Some children prenatally exposed to meth show elevated risks for attention deficits, behavioral problems, and learning difficulties as they grow. In the 1950s, Japan, that woke from a wartime meth wave, whole communities learned the hard lesson that legal and medical access to stimulants in one generation can leave social and developmental shadows on the next. Recovery is possible. The brain is plastic and can regain function over months and years. Nora Volkov's longitudinal PETI studies in the early 2000s offered a guarded hope. Some measures of dopamine transporter availability and prefrontal metabolic activity improved after sustained abstinence. Cognitive remediation, stable housing, nutrition, and therapy all help. But the path back is long, and in many places, funding and services are either scarce or oriented toward punitive outcomes rather than sustained support. For many individuals, the physiological adaptations, the weakened brakes in the prefrontal cortex, the shrunken reward responses, make staying away a huge daily act of will that requires systems of care rather than solitary resolve. If the brain and body tell one part of the story, the human toll tells another. And it is here the histories of families and communities become painfully visible across continents. Methamphetamine epidemics have a common script. They arrive quickly in certain social niches, they entrench where services are thin, and they spread along the logistical arteries of labor, migration, and trade. In rural American counties in the 90s and early 2000s, for example, secret mom-and-pop labs proliferated on quiet roads and in trailers, exploiting easy access to pseudoephedrine in over-the-counter cold medicines and the isolation that concealed fumes and explosions. Those small labs left chemical residues that rendered homes uninhabitable and imposed, cleanup costs that city budgets and personal savings could not easily bear. Child protective services began to see meth as the common factor in a rising share of neglect and abuse cases. In Missouri, Oklahoma, and parts of the upper Midwest, county courts and social services scrambled to meet a surge in family breakups and foster care numbers in the first decade of the 21st century. Urban traces look different, but are no less devastating. Cities that saw industrial decline and concentrated unemployment, places where housing stock is insecure and social capital frayed, provided fertile ground for meth spread. In the Tenderloin of San Francisco or the working-class neighborhoods of Melbourne, families fractured under the twin pressures of addiction and poverty. Children who might once have been shielded by extended kin networks found themselves in foster care, shuttled between homes. Parental incarceration for possession or related acquisitive crimes became a recurrent theme. Family structures collapsed, not merely from drug use, but from the criminal justice responses that removed breadwinners and caregivers. Certain populations have been hit disproportionately. Indigenous communities in North America and Australia, already contending with the intergenerational legacies of dispossession and poverty, found meth to be both an accelerant and a mirror of structural inequalities. In remote parts of Canada's Western provinces and the Northern Territories, and in the Northern Territory and Western Australia, community leaders spoke in the 2000s and 2010s of a crisis that arrived on flights and trucks along supply routes, finding in small towns a market that was not victimless. The social fabric, sporting clubs, schools, local governance, frayed as nights were lost to binges, as paychecks evaporated, as trust was replaced by suspicion. Governments moved with varying speed to respond. Some invested in culturally attuned treatment and housing. Others mainly pursued policing. The results were uneven. In Southeast Asia, meth's imprint was also heavy, but shaped by different histories. The crystalline pill forms known as yaba swept through Thailand and the Mekong region by the 1990s and 2000s. The social impact was widespread, from Bangkok's nightlife to the villages of Myanmar's borderlands. Governments oscillated between harsh enforcement and harm-minimizing strategies. In the Philippines, when Rodrigo Duterte assumed the presidency in 2016 and declared a nationwide war on drugs centered against Shabu, the state's response was immediate and brutal, with thousands of extrajudicial killings and deep international concern. The stated intention was to purge communities of the drug's harms. The result, as many human rights observers argued, was trauma, fear, and a further erosion of public trust in the institutions meant to protect citizens. That is the cruel arithmetic of punitive policy. It sometimes reduces visible open markets, but multiplies invisible harms. The LGBTQ+ communities in global cities offer yet another lens. Beginning in the late 20th century and spreading into the 2000s, meth use in certain circuits of gay men, part of chemsex cultures in London, Sydney, and New York, linked stimulants to sexual networks in ways that altered epidemiology. Longer sessions, multiple partners, and reduced inhibitions raised HIV transmission risks. Public health responses had to navigate stigma, criminalization, and the realities of pleasure and intimacy. Clinics that offered combined sexual health and addiction services, harm reduction through condoms, clean needles, and non-judgmental counseling made a measurable difference where they were available. But such integrated approaches were not uniformly available. These intimate devastations scale up to public systems. Emergency departments report spikes in stimulant-related presentations, psychosis, cardiovascular emergencies, severe withdrawal, mothers whose babies have been removed, needle-borne infections. Mental health services are overloaded with chronic psychosis and mood disorders. Child welfare agencies, as I said, see caseloads balloon. Homeless shelters fill with people who have been pushed out of employment. Employers find absenteeism and unsafe performance rising in sectors like trucking and mining. Economists can tally some of the costs. Healthcare, law enforcement, lost productivity, but the numbers never fully capture the quiet, accumulative sorrow of neighborhoods emptied of older social anchors. Public policy has sometimes been the solvent and sometimes the salt. In a key move, legislative action in the United States reshaped the course of the epidemic. The Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act of 2005 restricted over-the-counter access to pseudoephedrine, the common cold pill precursor that fueled domestic lab production in the 90s and early 2000s. The law worked in one sense. It dramatically reduced the proliferation of small, toxic household labs that exploded in trailer parks and buried their chemicals in backyard barrels. But the market adjusted. The vacuum that US policy created invited enterprises with deeper pockets and fewer scruples to scale up production elsewhere. Mexican cartels, already deeply involved in heroin and cocaine, moved aggressively into large-scale meth production, building super labs and establishing transnational precursor supply chains. Where one problem receded from front yards, a different set of harms arrived on a larger and often more violent scale. That judicial and logistical pivot is the central irony of enforcement. Supply-side pressures rarely eliminate demand. They shift geography, actors, and criminal strategies. After 2005, the small domestic manufacture largely disappeared from American headlines, replaced by cartel-run smuggling that crossed borders by sea, land, and air. The Sinaloa cartel, long a diversified enterprise based in the deserts and coastal regions of Sinaloa and Culiacan, expanded its share of the meth market in the late 2000s, producing high-purity crystalline meth and shipping it north. Other groups, Los Zetas in their brutal heyday and later the Jalisco New Generation cartel, entered the fray. What was once petty clandestine chemistry became an industrial-scale business, with supply chains reaching into Asia for precursors and corrupt pockets of local governance for protection. Asia, too, witnessed shifts. The Golden Triangle, Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand, changed shape as insurgent armies and criminal syndicates industrialized the production of pills and crystalline meth. Precursors flowed from chemical suppliers in East Asia into secret labs controlled by both private armies and criminal entrepreneurs. By the 2010s, Myanmar's Shan state had become a particularly prominent node for mass production, where armed groups and traffickers negotiated fragile truces and violent clashes in pursuit of profit. The UNODC repeatedly documented the rise of meth production in Southeast Asia, noting that the pills and crystals were no longer a marginal commodity, but a mass-market product. Every enforcement action rippled in the market. Crackdowns on precursors in China during the 2010s changed the calculus for chemists, pushing them toward alternative synthetic routes or different supply chains. When one choke point closed, another opened. Criminal enterprises are, after all, logisticians. They adapt. They also bring violence as a tool of governance. Territorial control, extortion, and brutality are ways to secure production and distribution networks. That is the clearest link between meth markets and high-level organized crime. The larger the enterprise, the greater the capital at stake, and the more willing actors become to use violence and corruption to secure that capital. At street level, meth fuels acquisitive crimes, theft, burglary, and robbery, as dependent users seek means to feed a habit that is expensive and erratically supplied. But meth-related criminality is not only about desperate users, it is also about organized violence, cartel shootouts, kidnappings, protection rackets. The social landscapes of cities and border regions change. Public spaces become dangerous. Local businesses pay levies to avoid violence. Municipal budgets redistribute from community services to night patrols and cleanups. The environmental toll is real too. Secret labs contaminate soil and water with solvents and byproducts. Cleanup is costly and rarely complete. Faced with such complexity, societies have chosen different mixes of response. Some double down on criminalization, preferring raids, mandatory minimums, and military-style interventions. Others lean toward harm reduction, treatment, and decriminalization. The Portuguese model, implemented in 2001, is instructive, even if not a perfect analog. By decriminalizing all drugs for personal use and investing heavily in treatment and social reintegration, Portugal shifted many users from the criminal justice system into public health care, with measurable declines in HIV transmission and drug-related deaths over a decade. It did not make drugs harmless. It reallocated societal effort toward health outcomes. The contrast with punitive campaigns, whether the militarized operations in parts of Mexico after 2006 under President Felipe Calderón, or the extrajudicial violence of the Philippines under President Duterte after 2016, is stark. In the latter, short-term displays of control produced humanitarian crises and, in many respects, did little to address the chronic needs of people struggling with addiction. Treatment itself remains a stubborn frontier. Unlike opioid addiction, for which methadone and buprenorphine provide clear pharmacological pathways to stabilization, meth addiction has no widely accepted pharmacotherapy with regulatory approval. Behavioral interventions, cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, have evidence, especially contingency management, for its pragmatic rewards-based structure. But these require sustained funding and political will. Rural and marginalized communities, the very places where meth often gains traction, frequently lack the infrastructure for these programs. Harm reduction measures, needle and syringe exchanges, sexual health services, safer consumption advice, blunt secondary harms but are politically toxic in many jurisdictions. There is also the problem of measurement and attention. When headlines chase meth's most dramatic violences, they sometimes miss the slow erosion of opportunity that the drug produces. A generation of workers cycling through jail and treatment and precarious labor markets, children whose schooling is interrupted, whole neighborhoods where civic participation dwindles. Those quieter damages are harder to legislate against because they are diffuse and chronic. The political system prefers crises it can declare won or lost. Yet history tells us that epidemics are shifted, not ended, by policy choices. When the United States closed small lab supply avenues in 2005, it did not abolish demand. When Mexico chose militarization in 2006, it did not cut off consumer markets to the north. When parts of Southeast Asia tightened border controls, production often migrated to new territories. The meth market is a hydra of supply chains and social needs. Cut one head, and two more will sprout, unless you simultaneously treat the wound that makes people consume. So we return to an old patient counsel. The problem is both biochemical and social. Meth changes brains and bodies. It fractures families and communities, and it creates markets where violence and corruption can flourish. The historical record, from Pervitin and Philippon in the 30s and 40s, through rural American labs of the 90s, to cartel superlabs in Sinaloa after 2005 and the Yaba factories of Shan State, shows a pattern of substitution and adaptation. Policymakers who ignore either the neurobiological compulsion or the social landscape do so at their peril. Compassionate treatment, sensible regulation of precursors, harm reduction, and measures that rebuild economic and social life in vulnerable places are not soft options. They are strategies that, unlike the old slogans of war and prohibition, account for human biology and human society together. The story of meth is a long, bitter tale, but it is not an inexorable one. Brains can heal, communities can be rebuilt, and history, if we listen carefully in the quiet, insists that policy is not destiny. It is choice. When governments first confronted the peculiar problem of methamphetamine, a molecule that had been promised as performance and then proved to be trouble, they did what governments often do. They organized themselves into committees, appointed czars, and chose metaphors. The metaphors mattered. In Washington in '71, the Nixon White House declared drug abuse public enemy number one, and the language of war furnished policy frameworks. Supply lines to be cut, invaders to be repelled, enemies to be arrested. The administration of programs followed the metaphors. The Drug Enforcement Administration, created in 1973, grew like a constabulary for chemical interdiction. In 1988, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act created the Office of National Drug Control Policy, a new bureaucracy whose daily bread was the rhetoric of interdiction. Across the Pacific in Tokyo, the experience tasted different but ended up with a similar appetite for control. Post-war revelations that methamphetamine, once distributed to soldiers and marketed as a stimulant, had leaked into a civilian market produced a fear that was translated into law and policing, into a cultural shaming that persists. In Southeast Asia, the image was of an economy of pills moving through jungle borders. In Mexico and Australia, it was men and women in garages and ranches producing crystalline forms for captive markets. The policy choices that followed were never purely technical. They were political declarations about what the state thought of suffering, sin, and safety. From that first impulse to punish, two very different currents of response have been visible for half a century. The heavy interdiction-focused model that put boots on streets and agents at ports, and the quieter, more careful public health model that looked to prevention, harm reduction, and treatment. The punitive model has clear, simple logic. Reduce supply, increase the cost and risk of dealing, deter consumers with the threat of jail. It likes clear enemies, clear metrics, arrests made, kilograms seized, and headlines. The Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act, signed in the United States in 2005, exemplifies this logic in legislative clothing. It tightened control over precursors, pseudoephedrine, phenylpropanolamine, pushing cold medicines behind pharmacy counters, instituting purchase limits and tracking, and legislating sharp penalties. It worked in its narrow sense. Within a few years, the number of small, one-pot domestic labs in the United States declined dramatically. Media stories about parents making meth in kitchen sinks became less common. The law achieved what laws often do. It changed supply mechanics, but supply-side wins hide messy trade-offs. Interdiction does not remove demand, and the marketplace, given human incentives, reorganizes. What was once a row of small operations in basements and trailers rearranged itself into international production, often under the auspices of transnational criminal groups. After the 2005 restrictions in the United States, chemical flows shifted south and east. Precursors were rerouted, and Mexican cartels scaled up the manufacture of higher purity crystalline methamphetamine for the American market, using different chemical routes and larger laboratories. Within the span of a decade, the site of a backyard lab in a Midwestern town had been replaced by long-distance trafficking networks and sophisticated secret industrial operations. Law enforcement victories felt immediate. The epidemiological curve of use did not bend so permanently. And where interdiction focuses, other harms multiply. Violence around production and transit nodes, corruption of local officials, incarceration that fractures families and reduces economic options for communities that most need investment. the public health alternative, in contrast, starts with a set of quieter, less cinematic observations. People who use drugs are not merely criminals. They are patients, neighbors, sometimes vulnerable citizens whose behaviors are driven by a web of social, economic, and psychiatric forces. Prevention investments in school programs, economic alternatives, family supports are long-term and unglamorous. Harm reduction, clean needles, supervised consumption rooms, drug checking, distribution of safer smoking kits can seem to some politicians and parts of the public like conceding defeat. But the evidence base that has accumulated since the HIV crisis of the 80s is hard to dismiss. Clean syringe programs dramatically reduce the transmission of bloodborne infections. Supervised consumption rooms like Insight in Vancouver, which opened in 2003 amid a finely detailed legal and political struggle and survived a landmark Supreme Court decision in Canada in 2011, reduced public injecting, increased uptake of detox and treatment services, and were not associated with increases in crime. Portugal's experiment, starting in 2001, decriminalisation of possession for personal use paired with expanded treatment and social support, offers a long-term example of shifting vast sums of social energy from prosecution toward care and produced declines in problematic use, drug-related deaths, and new HIV infections over time. These are not poetic victories. They are measurable and they are quiet. The comparison is not binary. The most successful systems have deployed hybrids that accept a role for law enforcement in disrupting violent traffickers and major production while insisting that the people on the receiving end of street markets be treated primarily through public health mechanisms. Australia's harm minimisation approach, adopted in policy language in the mid-80s and returned to with urgency during the ice crisis of the 2010s, coupled policing with needle exchanges, medically supervised injecting centres in some jurisdictions, and a steady growth of treatment capacity. Even as federal and state governments scrambled over whether to tighten precursor controls or to fund more services, the United States has found this hybrid awkward. Federal statutes and local politics have produced a spaghetti of responses. Regions that relied heavily on law enforcement, cities that invested in syringe exchange and overdose prevention, and countless lives caught in the seams. Punitive policies reduce certain visible harms in the short run, but if unaccompanied by prevention and care, can recur as displacement and violence. Public health policies reduce harm at the individual and community levels, but need political will and money. Without them, supply-side reductions can be cruel, producing temporary scarcity without addressing root causes. When we look at the interventions in practice, the diversity is striking. Drug courts, which began in the United States with a prototype in Miami-Dade County in '89, were born of the same hybrid impulse. Use the coercive power of the court to compel treatment rather than punishment. Participants are diverted from traditional prosecution into supervised regimens of therapy, urine testing, and monitored abstinence. Success is pronounced in some programs and limited in others. Meta-analyses show reductions in recidivism in many drug court models, but the effect sizes are modest and heavily conditioned on program fidelity, the degree to which magistrates and clinicians maintain therapeutic rigor rather than treating the court as a shortcut to punishment. The court is a blunt instrument. If it is used to funnel people into evidence-based treatment with sufficient resources, it can reduce crime and improve outcomes. If it is used to tidy up caseloads with token therapy, it becomes another conveyor belt to incarceration. Harm reduction programs read like a set of opposites to the courtroom's gavel. None of them are glamorous. All of them are practical. Syringe exchanges, distributed since the 80s, are a first line against infection. Safer smoking kits, provided in varying degrees in Australia, Canada, and parts of Europe, reduce burns and respiratory injuries from improvised pipes. Drug checking services, from simple colorimetric tests to infrared spectroscopy on the street, have proven life-saving where fentanyl contaminates stimulant supplies, a particularly cruel twist of the opioid epidemic in North America where methamphetamine suddenly carried a lethal, adulterant supervised consumption sites accept the reality of continued use and provide a controlled environment in which overdoses can be reversed and people can be connected to health services. They offend conservative sensibilities. They save lives. Public health literature is filled with polite, heavily footnoted ways of saying that the latter is more important. The politics of implementation matter with a severity that clinical trials seldom account for. Contingency management, the modestly radical idea of giving people small, reliable rewards for clean urine samples, reliably reduces methamphetamine use according to randomized trials from the United States to Australia. Yet it offends a moral intuition in some places. Paying people to be sober seems to opponents like bribery, and some funding sources explicitly prohibit it. Similarly, syringe exchanges were hampered for decades by federal prohibitions and local legal barriers in many American cities until pragmatic public health professionals, alarmed by HIV and hepatitis C outbreaks, pushed back. Drug policy is not simply a matter of evidence. It is a matter of rhetoric, of who gets to define virtue and of how budgets flow. When budgets reward arrest statistics rather than treatment retention, institutions tilt toward enforcement. Those institutional orientations have practical consequences for treatment and recovery. For methamphetamine use disorder, the hard clinical truth is that, as of 2024, there is no singularly effective, widely approved pharmacotherapy. Unlike opioid use disorder, where methadone and buprenorphine have changed the calculus of treatment and mortality, stimulants do not yet have an equivalent rescue medication. The clinical research landscape is messy but not empty. Psychosocial interventions, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, motivational interviewing, the matrix model, remain the backbone of care. The matrix model, developed in California in response to the proliferation of stimulant misuse, packages structured group therapy, individual counseling, family education, and random drug testing into an outpatient program designed for retention and relapse prevention. It is not an elegant silver bullet. It is a scaffolding under which recovery sometimes happens. Contingency management is the single psychosocial innovation with the most consistent randomized controlled trial support for stimulants, including methamphetamine. In trials where participants received vouchers or small cash rewards for biologically verified abstinence, rates of continuous abstinence and clinic attendance rose. The effect is nearly as robust as one could hope for in the behavioral sciences. Simple, replicable, and scalable. Yet the policy tempering of human incentive, rightly framed as civic prudence by some and as anachronistic moralism by others, has constrained uptake. It is almost comical. Evidence that behaviors can be shifted with a little money has collided with a belief that moral persuasion should be sufficient. The reality is prosaic. Time-limited financial rewards are not an affront to civilization. They are a pragmatic lever. On the pharmacological front, a handful of recent clinical trials have produced encouraging but cautious signals. Combination strategies, notably trials pairing bupropion, an antidepressant and mild stimulant, with naltrexone, an opioid antagonist that modulates reward pathways, have shown promise in particular subgroups, such as those with certain patterns of use or demographic profiles. Trials of mirtazapine have shown benefit in specific populations, men who have sex with men, particularly when meth use is tied to sexual behavior. Agonist strategies, prescribing controlled stimulants as a form of substitution therapy modeled conceptually after methadone for opioids, have been studied with low-dose dextroamphetamine or methylphenidate, trials suggesting potential utility in reducing illicit stimulant use. None of these approaches has yet delivered a universally approved, population-level treatment, which is to say that the pharmacological piece of the puzzle is in flight. It is promising in narrow windows and disappointingly absent as a universal panacea. That absence makes integrated community-based care all the more essential. Methamphetamine use often travels with psychiatric comorbidity, depressive disorders, anxiety, trauma histories, and stimulant-induced psychosis, and with infectious diseases transmitted through risky behavior. The most effective treatment models, therefore, do not treat meth use in isolation. They stitch together primary care, mental health services, infectious disease management, particularly hepatitis C treatment in the last decade, which is curative and should be part of any modern program, housing and employment supports, and peer recovery services. Assertive community treatment teams that bring multidisciplinary care into the community, housing-first programs that provide stable shelter without abstinence preconditions, and recovery community organizations that offer peer coaching and social capital all multiply the effect of therapy sessions. The science on the social determinants of recovery is increasingly precise. Stable housing, meaningful work, and social belonging are as potent as any specific manual-based therapy. Peer-led supports deserve particular attention because they carry a quality that bureaucratic programs often lack: trust. Recovery coaches, individuals with lived experience who are trained to provide outreach and support, are now integrated into many emergency departments. Treatment centers and re-entry programs, Oxford houses, the US model of democratically managed sober living homes that emerged in the 70s and proliferated thereafter, offer another community model: sober peers living and working together with minimal clinician oversight. Evidence suggests that peer support increases engagement, reduces relapse risk, and enhances retention in treatment. It is also cost-effective. Yet peer-led work is undervalued and underfunded in many countries where the default policy is top-down control. Access is an operational problem. A clinic can have excellent therapies on the books, but no staff who know how to deliver contingency management, no interpreters for multilingual communities, or no transportation funds to get clients in the door. In the United States, patchwork insurance coverage and the dynamics of states that did or did not expand. Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act mean that some regions were already struggling to pay for high-quality behavioral therapies when the meth wave grew. Rural areas, where outbreaks of stimulant use have often been intense, suffer from clinician shortages. Telehealth has helped, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, when regulatory flexibilities increased remote counseling and medication management. Yet telehealth cannot substitute for local housing and employment supports. The global topography of methamphetamine's harms is instructive because it insists that history, economy, and policy environments shape epidemics as much as the pharmacology of the drug itself. Consider Japan, which has a particularly instructive tale. The molecule's Japanese history began in laboratories in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when chemists like Nagai Nagayoshi first synthesized related compounds. During World War II, stimulant pills were distributable to augment soldier performance. In the dislocations of the post-war years, surplus supplies and a fragmented regulatory environment allowed methamphetamine's use to seed civilian markets. The moral panic that followed produced a distinctive national response: stringent legal controls, aggressive policing, and a cultural mechanism of shame that makes public acknowledgement of drug use socially ruinous. The result is paradoxical. On one hand, measured population surveys reveal that the prevalence of illicit drug use in Japan is low compared to many Western countries. On the other hand, when people are arrested for meth possession, the personal and social penalties, imprisonment, job loss, public disgrace, are severe, and recidivism is not uncommon because the social reintegration mechanisms are weak. The Japanese case illustrates a truth about punitive regimes. They can keep visible prevalence low while exacting a heavy toll on a smaller group of people. Southeast Asia's experience has been more openly explosive. The Yaba phenomenon, tablets of methamphetamine, often mixed with caffeine, spread across Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar with a rapidity that mirrored the land's porous borders and opaque economies. The Golden Triangle, once synonymous with opium and heroin production, reinvented itself again for meth militias, insurgent armies, and shadow economies built production infrastructure in the isolated hills of Shan State in Myanmar. By the mid-2010s, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reported seizures and production that dwarfed earlier eras, with tablets moving to urban centres and regional capitals. Thailand, which in 2003 launched a brutal and much criticised war on drugs under Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra that included extrajudicial killings, oscillated afterward between heavy-handed enforcement and pragmatic harm reduction to deal with the fallout. The region shows how production adapts to opportunity and how violent crackdowns can produce humanitarian crises without eliminating markets. Mexico's role in the methamphetamine story is architectural in scale. It is where production and transit combined into an industrial enterprise that furnished the North American market. Mexican cartels, Sinaloa, Jalisco New Generation, and others, adapted to US precursor restrictions by building upstream chemical networks and large processing facilities. The aftermath of the US Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act was predictable, in the way market adaptations often are. Reductions in small domestic labs in the United States translated into greater imports, purer products, and organized criminal involvement across borders. The Mexican state's own oscillation from local policing to the militarized campaign under President Felipe Calderón, beginning in 2006, which sought to decapitate cartels through force, produced an explosion of violence that eclipsed public health concerns. The ensuing years exposed the limits of supply-side remedies when they are waged, without a parallel expansion in demand. Reduction strategies and social investment. Australia's ice crisis of the 2010s forced a re-evaluation of policy. The crystalline form of methamphetamine, potent, smokable, socially disruptive, rose in visibility in cities and rural towns alike. The federal government's 2015 National Ice Task Force reported widely and recommended a blend of measures: a stronger treatment workforce, more research into pharmacotherapies, investment in diversion programs, and targeted law enforcement against traffickers. Australia's long-standing commitment to harm minimisation, for example, needle and syringe programs since the 80s, and the medically supervised injecting centre in Sydney, established in 2001, softened some harms, but the scale of meth's social impact, psychosis admissions, family breakdown, and police workloads demanded more than needle exchanges could deliver. The Australian story underscores the political hazard that comes with sudden spikes in visible harm. Once a crisis is framed in moral panic, resource allocation tends toward emergency policing rather than steady capacity building. The United States finally provides a case study in regional variability. Methamphetamine's epidemic has been uneven, episodic, and adaptive. In the 90s and early 2000s, the American West and Midwest saw high rates of meth involving numerous small domestic labs. The 2005 federal restrictions moved the locus of production southward and changed the commodity's characteristics. Purer, more crystalline, with consequences for patterns of use and harm. In the 2010s, meth combined tragically with the opioid crisis. Fentanyl contamination of stimulant supplies produced sharp increases in fatal overdoses among populations that had not previously experienced opioid-related mortality at the same scale. Regions such as Appalachia and parts of the rural Midwest experienced overlapping epidemics of meth use, economic decline, and insufficient access to care. The US response has been a collage. Some cities expanded syringe exchanges and naloxone distribution. Some counties increased drug court capacity. Some states restricted pseudoephedrine sales beyond the federal baseline, and others doubled down on enforcement. What do these comparative cases teach us about policy? First, context matters. Japan's heavy-handed, stigma-driven containment is not an easily transferable model to Myanmar or to Mexico. Cultural dynamics, governance capacity, and social safety nets shape what interventions will fly. Second, enforcement works at the margin. Targeted law enforcement against violent traffickers and large-scale production facilities is a necessary tool. It is not sufficient. Supply-focused policies often displace harm rather than extinguish it, unless they are embedded in a broader strategy that includes demand reduction and social investment. Third, harm reduction measures are transportable, evidence-based and politically contested, but where implemented, they produce measurable public health benefits. Fourth, treatment and recovery programs must be integrated into social services, housing, employment, mental health care. Last, international collaboration on precursor control is vital and complicated. Attempts to choke off chemical supplies can be effective, but only when paired with robust international monitoring and when sourcing nations are willing to regulate chemical industries. Otherwise, the trafficking adapts. Barriers to this integrative vision are not ideological alone. They're institutional. Ministries of health and ministries of justice speak different bureaucratic languages and answer to different voter logics. Law enforcement thrives on simple and visible victories. Health ministries count incremental health gains that rarely make headlines. International treaties like the Convention on Psychotropic Substances and the 1988 UN Convention Against Illicit Traffic embed criminalization into global law in ways that can complicate novel national experiments like Portugal's decriminalization. Corruption and violent competition for illicit rents blunt cross-border cooperation in regions where governance is fragile. And stigma, a social architecture that assigns moral failure to addiction, erodes political support for policies that are pragmatic and, to some, counterintuitive. If anything in this long chapter is gently hopeful, it is the scope for pragmatic combination. A community that invests in school-based prevention and family support, that funds contingency management and CBT, that provides housing, peer support, and syringe exchange, that pursues targeted law enforcement against violent and large-scale producers, and that pursues international agreements to monitor and regulate precursor chemicals will, on balance, reduce harm. It is a gardening metaphor. Pull the weeds where they choke everything. Tend the soil by funding healthcare and housing. Plant seeds of prevention early. It is not an overnight transformation. Gardens are patient work. Across the arc from punishment to prevention and then into recovery and comparative geography, one persistent truth remains. Policy is not magic. It cannot unmake chemistry, and it cannot simply will away the historical conditions, wars, poverty, displacement, inequality, that make stimulants attractive to some people. It can, however, change the terms of risk and the texture of care. The evidence favors policies that treat methamphetamine not merely as a criminal problem, but as a chronic, treatable public health issue, one that responds best to a combination of modest, evidence-based clinical practices and solid investments in social infrastructure. That is the lesson of places like Portugal and Vancouver and some parts of Australia. It is also the stubborn lesson of places where punitive action without proportional care produces cycles of harm. The super soldier dream that once animated military laboratories has evaporated into an altogether different human problem: how to reduce suffering and rebuild lives when a drug that promised endurance delivered erosion. In the quiet work of clinics, peer support meetings, supervised rooms, and family interventions, there are small, empirically grounded victories that do not always attract the cameras. In the louder theatres of politics, policymakers will continue to prefer tidy metrics, seizures, arrests, and occasional high-profile indictments. The history of methamphetamine teaches a humbling truth about scale, that the epidemic's curve is shaped as much by chemistry as by cultural choices and policy, architectures, and a practical truth about strategy. Mix the care with the clamps, invest in the people we wish to help, and measure what matters to human flourishing. If you imagine a policymaker tucking this problem in like a child at the end of a long day, perhaps their best acts will be gentle. Close the door on punitive excess, smooth the blanket of services across the bed of need, and leave the light on for the slow, steady work of recovery.